The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones, whispering to you that you don't belong here. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Stonehaven Estate, and in the warm glow of the fire, something unexpected was unfolding. A young woman, tired rain-damp hair curling against her cheeks, sat curled on the Persian rug, her arms cradling a baby no bigger than a loaf of bread. The baby's small fist clutched her shirt as though afraid to let go. She hadn't meant to fall asleep there. She'd meant to calm the crying, but somewhere between the soft humming and the rhythmic sway of her body, exhaustion claimed her. From the shadows, a man watched, tall, broad-shouldered, his face carved from years of responsibility, his eyes softened at the sight before him. He had hired her to clean floors and polish silver, nothing more. Yet here she was, holding his daughter with the kind of fierce, protective tenderness that no paycheck could buy. What happens when two broken paths cross in a house that is known more silence than laughter? Can a man who's built walls higher than the pines outside find room in his life and in his heart for the one woman who never asked for it? And will she trust a future after years of believing she didn't deserve one? Stay until the end, because this isn't just a love story. It's about second chances you never saw coming. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to John's Stories channel so you don't miss the next story that might just change the way you see the world.
The rain had not stopped for days in Boston. It came in sheets, smudging the city lights into blurred halos, running down old brick buildings like tears that had nowhere else to go. In a cramped basement apartment, Natalie Cooper sat in a chair so old it wobbled when she breathed. A notice clutched in her trembling hands: vacate in 15 days, 3 months overdue. The words were stark, printed in block letters that showed no mercy. She read them again, not because she didn't understand, but because she wished they would change. They didn't. They never did. Natalie had once been a pastry chef, the kind of baker who could coax warmth out of sugar and butter the way others coaxed smiles from children. But dreams had a way of getting buried under rent slips and final warnings. This was her third job loss in half a year. "We need someone faster," her last boss had said, his eyes already sliding past her to the next resume in the pile. It wasn't the first time she'd heard those words, or their meaning. Not good enough. Those 3 words had been the refrain of her life. She was 7 when a house fire claimed her parents. One moment, she was wrapped in her mother's laughter. The next, she was waking in a strange iron cot at a city orphanage. No visits, no gentle hand on her shoulder when nightmares came. She learned to keep her voice low, her steps quieter still. And when foster homes came, they brought chores, cold instructions, and the quiet reminder that she was there to be useful, not to belong. By the time she aged out of the system, she had perfected the art of survival. Keep your head down, don't expect too much, and never give anyone the chance to throw you away. That evening, the phone rang, the sound cutting through the damp heaviness like a rescue line. On the screen, a name she hadn't seen in months: Isabel Hart, her one real friend from the chaos of her 20s. "Natalie, listen," Isabel's voice came warm and urgent. "My neighbor's boss needs a live-in housekeeper who can also help with his baby. Good pay, room and board. You'd be perfect." Natalie almost laughed. "I've never been a housekeeper. I wanted to open a bakery, Isabel, not dust chandeliers for some stranger." "You've survived worse than this," Isabel said, her tone steady but kind. "This isn't forever. It's a roof over your head, a chance to breathe until you figure things out. Don't turn it down because it's not the dream job." Natalie looked around her apartment. A nearly empty fridge, an overdue electric bill.
rain seeping through the warped window frame. Dreams didn't keep you warm in January. She agreed. The bus ride to Aspen took 2 days, winding through landscapes that shifted from steel gray city blocks to mountains draped in white. Natalie sat by the window, her breath clouding faintly on the glass, her suitcase at her feet, and a battered wooden box on her lap. Inside were the only things she'd never sold, given away, or lost: a rolling pin with a worn handle, a few dented baking molds, and a recipe notebook she'd been adding to since she was 16. It wasn't just flour and sugar in those pages. Each recipe was a memory, a person, a place. The bus slowed, tires crunching over snow-packed road, and stopped before tall iron gates. Beyond them, Stonehaven Estate rose from the hillside like something out of a winter painting. A dark slate roof beneath heavy snow, walls of silver-gray stone, tall windows draped in burgundy curtains. It had the grandeur of a place that had never known want, and the quiet of a place that had long stopped expecting joy. The front door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, posture perfect, hair pinned with precision. "You must be Natalie Cooper," she said. "I'm Mrs. Pennington. I run the household." Her voice was not unkind, but it carried the tone of someone accustomed to order. Inside, the ceiling soared, crystal chandeliers scattering soft light over polished floors. Abstract paintings lined the halls, each frame catching a glint of gold. It was beautiful, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the snow outside. Natalie's room was upstairs, a neat space with a bed pressed against the wall and a small table by the window. The view was of an endless forest of pines, branches heavy with snow. "Your hours end at 8, Mrs. Pennington explained. "The side kitchen and laundry room are yours to use. Baby Ella has a daytime nanny, but you may be asked to help. And one more thing. No one enters the library or Mr. Blake's study unless invited." It was as she turned toward the door that Natalie heard it, the soft babble of a child, followed by the sound of measured footsteps. At the top of the staircase stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly combed dark hair, and the kind of presence that seemed to fill the air before he even spoke. In his arms was a baby girl, no more than 10 months old, wrapped in a white knit sweater. He said simply, "You're the new one." Natalie nodded. "Yes, sir." He said, "I ask only for efficiency and silence." His voice was deep, clipped, as if every word was weighed before it left his mouth. With that, he turned, carrying Ella down the hall. The baby glanced back, wide-eyed, one tiny hand clutching her father's shirt. Then they disappeared behind a closed door. Days at Stonehaven passed in quiet rhythm. Natalie dusted shelves, polished silver, and prepared simple meals in the side kitchen. Sometimes she caught the faint echo of laughter from Ella when Mrs. Pennington played with her. But Adrian, Blake, the man behind the clipped introduction, was often absent, leaving early and returning late, as if he lived in a different time zone from the rest of the house. One Saturday evening, the rhythm broke. Adrian had left in a rush, coat half-buttoned, his SUV tires throwing snow as he drove off. An hour later, Ella's soft whimpers began. Natalie tried everything: a fresh diaper, a warm bottle, even opening the curtains to show her the falling snow. But the cries only grew sharper, carrying a note Natalie recognized in her bones. She gathered the baby into her arms, rocking her slowly by the fire. "It's okay, little one. I know this feeling. I used to cry like this too when no one came." Her voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of a memory she rarely let surface. The baby's sobs eased to hiccups, then to quiet breaths, her tiny fingers curling into the fabric of Natalie's sweater. The warmth of the fire blurred the edges of the room. Natalie didn't remember closing her eyes. When Adrian returned, the house was silent. Stepping into the living room, he stopped. On the rug, Natalie slept with Ella cradled to her chest, both faces turned toward the fire. Something in him stilled. Not surprise, but the ache of recognition. He fetched a blanket from the sofa, laid it gently over them, and stood there for a long time listening to the soft harmony of his daughter's breaths with the deeper rhythm of a woman who, for reasons he didn't yet understand, had quieted a part of his house that had been restless for too long.
He didn't mention the blanket in the morning, neither did she, yet the house felt fractionally different, as if a window had been cracked open in a sealed room. It showed up in small ways. Natalie noticed that the fire was already lit when she came downstairs before dawn. Mrs. Pennington, who usually measured words like teaspoons, left a second cup beside the coffee pot. Even Ella's babbles sounded less like echoes and more like a conversation waiting to happen. Natalie worked with unhurried competence, the sort that never drew attention to itself. She learned which floorboards groaned and which cupboard doors stuck for a second before yielding. She learned that the copper pot in the back of the side kitchen warmed milk without scorching, and that Ella liked the little hum Natalie had picked up from an old radio jingle. In another life, she might have called these preferences. Here, they felt like a map, a way to move through a landscape that could have swallowed her whole. Order gave the day a spine. Quiet gave it a heartbeat. Late one afternoon, a rare slant of sun fell through the tall window panes, turning the dust in the library into glittering motes. The door, usually shut, stood open. Natalie had come for fresh logs, her arms circled around the bundle, when she heard his voice from inside, not sharp as it had been that first day, just contained. "Do you like reading?" She stopped at the threshold. Adrian stood by one of the tall shelves, a leather-bound book open in his hands. He didn't look up at first, and it took her a beat to find her voice. "I do," she said, "or I used to. The orphanage had a donation cart, paperbacks people left behind on buses. I read them all, even the ones missing the last chapter." He lifted an eyebrow, the shadow of a smile tugging at his mouth. "And the endings you were denied?" "I made them up," she said, surprised at her own honesty. Some stories deserved mercy. A silence followed that wasn't empty. He nodded toward the logs, and she set them by the hearth, careful not to scatter bark across the rug. When she left that evening, tired in the clean way that good work could make you tired, she found a copy of Jane Eyre laid on her pillow. No note, no signature, a simple offering, one she understood without translation. Changes rarely announce themselves. They arrive as a rhythm that feels, after a while, like the way things have always been. Adrian began to return earlier. He stopped passing through rooms as if they were tunnels to be crossed as quickly as possible. He stood sometimes in doorways, listening to Ella's small laugh when Natalie stacked wooden blocks into a precarious tower. And the moment the tower fell, how Natalie would clap as if collapse were part of the game. He watched her ask the baby's permission with her eyes before picking her up, and how Ella, serious as a judge, would gradually soften, arms lifting, trust given instead of taken. A week later, Mrs. Pennington appeared in the laundry room where Natalie was folding towels into neat stacks that looked like short stories lined up on a shelf. "Mr. Blake would like a word," she said. Not stiff, not warm, just neutral, but with something like curiosity under it. His study was the room the house breathed from, dark-paneled and ordered, with a long table set up beside the desk. On it lay a mocked-up interface printed on matte boards, markers uncapped and arranged in a straight line. A small team waited, 2 designers, a social worker who introduced herself as Rachel, and a developer with a notebook full of tidy squares. Adrian gestured for Natalie to come closer. "We're building a pilot," he said, "for single mothers navigating housing, childcare, jobs, legal aid. There are resource lists everywhere, but too many dead links, forms that crash old phones, maps that assume you own a car. We want to cut through that." Natalie hesitated, instinctively looking down at her sweater for lint. "Sir, I'm not—" "You're exactly the kind of person the app should work for," Rachel said gently. "If it can't pass the Natalie test, it's not ready." He handed Natalie one of the boards,
A home screen sketched with boxes labeled shelter, food, daycare, hotline. The fonts were clean, the colors unoffensive. It looked like something that would photograph well in a press release. "Can I be honest?" Natalie asked. Adrian's answer was immediate. "Please." She pointed to the tiny icons. "These are small. People will be using this while holding a baby on a bus or walking to a second job. And old phones. If the load time is more than a couple of seconds, they'll think it's broken. Also, not everyone uses the same words. Childcare sounds like a government form. Who can watch my kid is how most of us say it." The developer's pencil paused. Something clicked in the room you could almost hear, like a gear finding its tooth. Natalie suggested an offline mode for patchy service, a way to save documents in-app so a lost email didn't erase a month's work. A button that called a human after hours instead of offering a cheerful bot. She mentioned library hotspots, church basements with play corners, the Wednesday morning food pantry behind the pharmacy that never advertises. The suggestions weren't theory, they were the breadcrumb trail of someone who had spent years making a map no one handed her. Rachel told a story of a mother she'd worked with in Detroit who missed a housing appointment because the bus route changed without notice. The developer, John, offered an example from his sister, who balanced a toddler, a diaper bag, and a cracked screen in a rainstorm because the shelter text didn't say the door was around the back. They adjusted the wireframes. They ignored nothing that came from use. In a world where the loudest ideas often win, this table made room for the truest ones.
Over the next weeks, Natalie's hours shifted. She still polished silver and kept the side kitchen arranged like a reliable friend, but when meetings were called, she took a seat without apology. She learned the cadence of the team. The developers were precise, the designers protective of visual harmony, Rachel relentless about reality. Adrian orchestrated without crowding, the way a conductor knows when a section can carry the theme without his baton. He didn't praise often. When he did, it was the kind that landed. "You did good work," he said one evening by the sink as she rinsed glasses for the dishwasher. "You saved us 3 months of assumptions." Natalie didn't know what to do with the warmth that rose in her chest. She pressed the edge of the dish towel flat with her thumb until it passed. Sometimes, when Ella napped, Natalie sat by the library window with Jane Eyre open on her lap, rereading a paragraph just to feel the old language climb its careful stairs. She found herself thinking less about the Gothic shadows and more about the stubborn dignity of a woman who knew the price of her own worth. It was strange comfort, this idea that endurance could be an art form and not just a bruise. If you asked Natalie to name the moment when the fault line appeared, so hair-thin you could mistake it for a scratch, she would point, later, to the day the black SUV came up the drive. She had been folding laundry in the attic room, that son's stubborn silence broken by a motor she didn't recognize. There was money in the sound, the kind of money that's never had to announce itself. She moved to the window. Snow softened the edges of the world. A woman stepped out, tall, blonde curls tucked into a scarf, the unhurried confidence of someone who didn't need to rehearse her entrance. The house seemed to stand still as the front door opened. Natalie didn't go downstairs. She told herself it wasn't her business. But on the landing, the study door stood slightly ajar, and a line of warm light cut across the hall. She paused, not even breathing for a moment, and saw just enough. Adrian by his desk, his posture guarded, the woman holding Ella with the natural certainty of someone who knew the child's weight. The baby, usually wary in unfamiliar arms, slept with her cheek against that shoulder as if she had never left it. What Natalie didn't hear, the quiet, measured exchange, the woman, Lydia, saying she hadn't come to rewrite anything, only to see the daughter she had failed to stay for, to look at her a minute and then go. What Natalie didn't see, the way Adrian's jaw worked, as he said the past had already been buried, the way Lydia nodded, admitting that some goodbyes happen long after the door has closed. What Natalie felt, that old precise sting of being reminded where the threshold is and which side of it you belong on. People like to think heartbreak is loud,
Often it moves under the skin with the discipline of a monk. Natalie finished the laundry. She put away the towels that still held faint warmth from the dryer. She cleared the side kitchen, wiped the counters until they shone, tied the trash neatly, labeled a container of soup for tomorrow. She left everything better than she found it, the way she'd been taught in every place that was never hers. She didn't leave a note. For a person who had spent a life trying not to be a problem, the note felt like a demand. She packed what she had, the rolling pin, the dented molds wrapped in a dishcloth, the notebook whose stained pages she knew by touch alone. She put on the coat that had been good enough in Boston and insufficient here. She lifted her suitcase by the handle that pinched the skin between her fingers. She walked through rooms that recently began to feel less like architecture and more like possibility, careful not to scuff the polished floor. Outside, the world exhaled cold. Snow made its own quiet grammar, each wheel turn of the suitcase writing a sentence that erased itself as it went. She didn't look back, maybe because looking back would have required staying long enough for doubt to argue its case. She went to the bus station, where the ceilings always seem too low and the coffee tastes like defeat, until it doesn't. She bought a ticket with the cash she had and the faith she borrowed. On the ride west, she slept in the careful way you sleep in transit, waking to check the bag where you keep your few necessary papers, dozing again when the rhythm of the road promises, however briefly, that you're being carried. Outside the window, America changed outfits. Fir trees and iron bridges, then yellow plains shocked into green by irrigation, then rainy hills and a river fat with winter snowmelt. She watched towns flicker and disappear, the names so quickly replaced that none of them could claim her.
In Portland, the air smelled like coffee and wet bark. The attic room she found had a skylight that turned rain into a painting, and a floor that remembered other tenants with each creak. The kitchen was a suggestion, 2 burners and a sink. And yet with the first batch of dough, the place began to feel less like an interim address and more like a pause with a pulse. She rolled pastry on a borrowed board, coaxing butter and flour into truce. She learned the markets, which neighborhoods bought early, which waited until noon, which appreciated a hand-lettered sign, and which wanted a card reader that never failed. She stood behind a simple wooden table and sold what her hands had made, and strangers left better than they arrived, a phenomenon as old as ovens. She called her stall Flower and Grace, half pun, half prayer. The name fit. People asked if she took special orders. She did. A man in a navy jacket came every Saturday for 2 lemon tarts because his late wife had loved them. He ate one in the park and left the other on her headstone. A nurse finished a night shift and bought a cinnamon roll before sleep. A child saved coins in a sock to buy a cookie shaped like a star. It is fashionable to be cynical about small commerce. It is harder to dismiss a line of ordinary kindnesses that smell like orange zest and sound like thank you. Midweek, Natalie volunteered an hour at a community kitchen where the manager, Maya, who ran on coffee and conviction, kept a corkboard list of rooms to let, secondhand cribs, night classes, and babysitting swaps that actually showed up. Natalie taped a 3x5 card to the board with a quiet hand. If your phone is old and a website won't load, try the downtown library, 4th floor, east side. Their Wi-Fi is the only one that reaches the window bench. Ask for Elias. She didn't sign her name. She never liked making noise when the music itself was enough. Back at Stonehaven, winter began to feel like a question Adrian couldn't answer. The rooms were still polished, the fire still obedient, the meetings still stacked like crisp envelopes. But Ella cried longer now, searching the air as if it should produce someone. Mrs. Pennington did what veterans do. She steadied, but even she couldn't plaster over the hole cleanly. Adrian carried his daughter until his arms ached, walked tiles he had never noticed underfoot until he knew every crack. The quiet he had previously curated like an art piece began to weigh. It's an odd thing when the very conditions you once chose become unbearable simply because you know another arrangement exists. At his desk, contracts waited with their patient logic. He read them, and something in him refused to lift the pen. In meetings, he rejected proposals that confused profit for purpose with a decisiveness that startled his board. Rachel watched him narrowly and finally said, after a long pause, "You're different." He didn't deny it. Some truths announce themselves through subtraction. He found the blank notepad where Natalie had once tested pens to see which wrote smoothest. He didn't know how to find her. Yet people like Natalie leave trails the way good ideas do: small, practical, honest. He asked the developer if the mock hotline was getting calls from Oregon. He asked the intern who had chatted with her about farmers markets whether she remembered which weekend had the better crowd. He took a flight he didn't announce, paid for a hotel room with a view of the river he barely noticed, rented a car that smelled like somebody else's new start. He drove to markets laid out like sentences, stall after stall, each punctuation a human trying to turn a skill into a livelihood. What he would say, he didn't rehearse. Rehearsals had not served him well with truth. He walked aisles where wool scarves met wooden spoons, where pottery held its breath on shelves, where a woman sold soap named after rain. He scanned faces not for beauty, though there was plenty of it, but for a posture that suggested both persistence and a willingness to be surprised. He told himself he would know her by the way relief worked on his bones like heat after cold. And when he saw her, he did.
She stood behind a plain wooden table, arranging a row of tarts with the same care a jeweler might give to lining gemstones in a velvet case. A cream sweater softened the lines of her shoulders, her brown hair catching the late afternoon light so that every strand looked brushed with gold. Around her, the weekend market carried on, vendors calling out prices, paper bags rustling, a street musician coaxing an old tune from a battered guitar. But for Adrian, the sound dimmed. All the months between this moment and the last time he'd seen her collapsed into the distance between one heartbeat and the next. His feet slowed until he stood just a few steps away, unsure whether to speak or to let her finish aligning the pastries as if the outcome of the day depended on symmetry. When she finally looked up, her gray-blue eyes froze for a fraction of a second, and in that pause, the air between them filled with the unspoken, the night by the fireplace, the quiet mornings, the pages of Jane Eyre left without a note, the sound of suitcase wheels leaving the driveway. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl either. She simply held his gaze as if measuring the weight of his arrival. "I thought," Adrian began, but the sentence trailed off. He wasn't a man accustomed to speaking without knowing the end of his own thought. "You thought what?" she asked, her voice calm, but not without a thin thread of caution. "I thought I could run my life without interruptions." He glanced at the pastries, at the steam curling from the coffee in the paper cup beside her till box. "Turns out, the quiet I had wasn't the kind that heals. It was the kind that starves you slowly." Her brow tightened slightly, but she said nothing. The market moved around them, people stepping past, conversations weaving in and out like threads they weren't part of. "I didn't come to drag you back to Stonehaven," he continued, his voice quieter now, stripped of the formality she'd known before. "I came because I realized what I needed wasn't what I left behind. It's you, here, now, not as an employee, not as a shadow in my home, as my partner, the woman I will not take for granted again, and as Ella's mother, if you'll have her." For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the street musician tuning his guitar again. Natalie's gaze dropped to the table, to the tart she had just placed in the center. Perfectly round, edges crimped like lace. Her fingers traced the rim of the plate as if the decision she was weighing required a physical anchor. Trust, she knew, was not a switch. It was a slow turn, like a heavy gate on rusted hinges, needing patience, steadiness, and the will to keep pushing even when it seemed stuck. "She can't go back to what it was," she said at last. "I'm not asking for what it was," Adrian replied. "I'm asking for something we build from here, and I'm prepared to build it one day at a time." The afternoon light deepened into gold. Around them, the rhythm of the market continued. Laughter, bartering, the faint scent of fresh bread carried on the breeze. And slowly, the tightness in her face eased. 3 months later, spring came to Portland with the gentlest kind of confidence. Leaves unfurled in 100 shades of green, morning smelled faintly of lilac and fresh coffee, and the market stalls began to fill earlier each Saturday. Natalie's table grew busier, not just with customers, but with friends. Regulars knew her by name, and some brought ingredients they thought she might like: a jar of homemade jam, a bag of heirloom apples, or a bouquet of edible flowers wrapped in brown paper. Adrian was there often, not hovering, but present, helping load the car, brewing coffee before the sun was up, keeping Ella amused with wooden puzzles under the shade of a nearby awning. The man who once measured success in contracts and polished boardroom presentations now found a strange contentment in peeling oranges for a toddler while Natalie tied ribbons on pastry boxes. One bright morning, in the middle of the market's hum, Adrian stepped to her side. No display, no grand speech, just a small silver ring in his palm, its surface catching the light like water. "This isn't about the past," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made her chest ache. "It's about every morning we haven't lived yet, as long as you'll have me." The chatter around them softened, as if the air itself held its breath. Natalie felt the heat rise behind her eyes. She brushed her fingertips over the cool metal, feeling the solidness of it, the quiet promise. And finally, she nodded. Yes. The applause that rippled through the nearby stalls wasn't loud, but it was warm, the kind that folds around you like a blanket. Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger, and for the first time in a long while, Natalie didn't feel like she was standing on the threshold of someone else's life. She was home.